I welcome you to the afternoon plenary session and special tribute to Charlene Mitchell. It is with humility and excitement that I open this session in which you will hear both lifelong radical activist Charlene Mitchell by way of DVD and Angela Davis. Ms. Mitchell, to whom we pay tribute for more than 50 years of radical activism and advocacy of justice in this nation, on the continent of Africa, and around the world. You will hear it via the DVD of a 2004 presentation she made at the Yari Yari conference. Professor Davis, you will hear in our closing keynote address on one of her mentors and friends, our honoree. As we consider Black women and the radical tradition, the task given to me is both to moderate this session and to offer some introductory comments focused on one specific chapter in the life of Charlene Mitchell. I've been asked to speak for a few minutes on the involvement of Charlene Mitchell and the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression in the case of State versus Joanne Little. This gives me an opportunity to speak to the on-the-ground activism of this mentor friend of Angela Davis in the context of her commitment to yet another young woman of a third generation, Joanne Little. Let me hasten so that we may hear from Angela Davis. It was Ella Baker who said, in order to see where we are going, we must not only remember where we have been, but we must understand where we have been. With that in mind, may I ask you to travel back in time so that I may share with you what I have learned about Charlene Mitchell through research and through an interview I was able to conduct with her in 1995. I probably have been trying to be an organizer most of my life, Charlene Mitchell announced to me in 1995, as she told me two quick stories about her childhood and adolescence. At age 7 in Cincinnati, Ohio, Charlene's mother's illness necessitated that Charlene take several buses for one of the scariest trips on which she had ever been thus far in her life. She was on her way to the federal jail to visit her labor activist father. After a long ride with several transfers, she arrived so late at the federal jail that the guards deemed it too late for her to really have any kind of visit. Technically, at the time of her arrival, visiting hours were not over, and Charlene, at age 7, argued the point, protesting the guards' decision, which, if implemented, would prevent her from visiting her father and delivering a basket of items her mother had entrusted to her for him. With what she remembers and describes as hollering and demanding, she managed to persuade the armed guard to let her go up in the jail elevator at the very end of visiting hours then, and then after she hollered some more, she persuaded the guard that visiting her father with the glass between them was completely unacceptable and made it impossible for her to deliver the basket. The guards held the basket and let her go into the room where there were table visits permitted, providing visitors remained on their side of the table. As soon as Charlene's father came out and sat down, Charlene jumped around the table and sat on his lap. The guards threw up their hands, but she was not finished yet. She kept talking to them about the basket, telling the guards they could not go away with her father's basket, until they finally agreed that her father could see the basket before they took it back for inspection. And in their very next conversation, Charlene's mother and father had, the father told her mother, "Never let Charlene come again." It was too hard on him, and the jailers would never get over it. Charlene's early activism with the goal of eliminating racial segregation consisted of protests, picket lines, demonstrations, and sit-ins at the Windsor Theater on North Side Chicago that segregated blacks in balconies, and down the street from the Windsor at a bowling alley. The students, American Youth for Democracy, black and white teenagers from various schools in the Chicago area, led and organized by 13-year-old Charlene, picketed the theaters with little success and eventually staged in the 1940s a sit-in with whites going up to the colored-only balcony and blacks sitting downstairs and refusing to move from the whites-only main floor. Soon the theater was emptied out, except for Charlene and her fellow members of the AYD. That eventually ended the segregation of that theater. The next target, the bowling alley, which was about 3 doors south, was assailed by these organized white and black teenagers under the leadership of Charlene Mitchell. And Charlene describes the action at age 14 now. These were her beginnings, she said, trying to organize young black and white kids who were in different schools, and she casually added, it was at 14 the first time I was arrested, and the first time I went to court. Jails and courts would become all too familiar to Charlene, who became a member of the Communist Party USA, and as you will hear from Dr. Davis, an activist with wide-ranging concerns. It was not unusual for her to be drawn to campaigns against injustice and prisoners, and if we fast forward to the 1970s, she was chief among those mounting a movement to free Angela Davis, free Benjamin Chavis, and the Wilmington 10, and a bit later to free Joanne Little. Unlike cases of Angela Davis, Ben Chavis, the Wilmington 10, Joanne Little was not in jail for demonstrating or organizing to protest racial injustice. Her brother had turned state's evidence against her, and at 19, between his testimony and Joanne Little's refusal to name her boyfriend in connection with any crimes, Joanne Little was sentenced to a minimum of 7 years and a maximum of 10 years for breaking and entering. She had not yet been transferred to the Women's Correctional Center, but instead was awaiting an appeal in her hometown county jail, the Beaufort County Jail, when on August 27, 1974, her jailer, Clarence Alligood, according to Little's testimony, forced her to have sex with him, and she stabbed him in self-defense. She escaped and then turned herself in to have her day in court and be vindicated. When Ben Chavis met her and thereafter told Charlene Mitchell and Angela Davis about Joanne Little, it became a case that he wanted to bring to the attention of the National Alliance. The context itself was distressing, for Inez Garcia had been tried for the murder of her rapist and lost her case. The National Alliance had declared the state of North Carolina a national disaster. The designation of North Carolina as a disaster area was based largely on its dubious distinction of one of the most repressive states in the nation. As the Alliance, directed by Charlene Mitchell, reported, and I quote, repression in North Carolina has been rapidly developing and enlarging its grasp as evidenced by the stark terror, poverty, and abridgment of constitutional rights. The state of North Carolina has revitalized its efforts to complete the death sentence for crimes such as first-degree burglary and rape. Its 31 persons on death row constituted almost 50% of the nation's listed doomed inmates. It had political prisoners more per capita than any other state, and steadily increased its racist strong-arm tactics against African Americans. And finally, it infamously held behind bars the Wilmington 10, the Charlotte 3, any number of other political prisoners, and still retained on its books a shoot-to-kill outlaw statute against alleged felons who were on the run. The Alliance was central to the organization of an international movement in defense of the Wilmington 10. In contrast, it became in late 1974, part of a coalition of organizations loosely coordinated but bound in the common purpose to free Joanne Little. The diverse coalition, I will name just a few, included SCLC from time to time, United Church of Christ Commission on Racial Justice, the Southern Poverty Law Center, the National Organization for Women, National Black Feminist Organization, Bernice Johnson Reagan and Sweet Honey in the Rock, North Carolina's Concerned Women for Justice, the Bay Area Women Against Rape, Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority, the Alliance of Lesbian Feminists of Atlanta, the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, particularly its Winston-Salem branch, and, of course, thousands of individuals inside and outside of the United States who supported Little with small donations and their presence at local as well as major national demonstrations. There was a Joanne Little Defense Fund, the Broad Umbrella, and of course, the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression, co-founded by Charlene Mitchell, Angela Davis, and others. Whereas the Alliance's anchor case in North Carolina was the Wilmington 10, and the state chapter as well as the national office had focused much of the attention on demonstrations and fundraising efforts for the Wilmington 10 and Ben Chavis, Chavis himself urged that the Alliance turn and look to the case of this 20-year-old black woman who was poor and facing a first-degree murder charge and the gas chamber. Charlene Mitchell's specific contributions, and I'll name a few, beyond financial ones, were at several levels. She brought extensive organizing experience and facilitated mobilization of large numbers of people to become Little's supporters. Charlene Mitchell came to her position as executive director of the National Alliance after an extraordinary career as a successful radical activist for civil rights, African liberation support, labor, political prisoners, and in having built a tremendous organization of people. She proved right in assessing and understanding what she called the machinations of the justice system. She successfully used the momentum, commitments, and critiques of United States oppression and repression to create the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression after having been engaged and involved in the movement to free our Speaker, Angela Davis. It was the Alliance that organized a massive and major demonstration in Washington, D.C., additionally based upon experiences with other struggles and the movement in support of Angela Davis's freedom. In particular, Charlene Mitchell strategically had members of the Alliance hold local or regional demonstrations and march on same day as national rallies or local rallies for related causes such as the Wilmington 10. Second, Charlene Mitchell interpreted the case in such a way as to gain widest support and offered an analysis that was persuasive. The Alliance took the Little case and applied the same process as other successful cases. Mitchell interpreted broadly the Little case in relationship to the prison system, how women were treated, the rights of guards to rape their prisoners without fear of themselves being tried, that white men were almost never convicted of raping women, self-defense, a fair trial, the prison system, another issue, the consequences of poverty, repression, racism, all identifying causes around which she believed the general public could defend Joanne Little's rights. And for those who were having doubts about self-defense, Charlene Mitchell strongly posited, and I quote, "No one can ever consent to have anything with their jailer. Any relationship is one of unequals, and therefore consent is out of the question." Third, Charlene Mitchell met with the chief co-counsel, Jerry Paul and Karen Galloway, to learn about the case and to discuss openly issues of race, gender, and class as they pertain to the status of Joanne Little in comparison to more privileged African American girls and women with more affluent backgrounds. Charlene Mitchell argued the importance of investigating poverty, access to education, employment opportunities. Charlene Mitchell also met with the defendant and affirmed the importance of her comrade and friend, Angela Davis, visiting and working with Little. This fourth contribution led to a major change within the Joanne Little case because it became possible for Joanne Little to interact with and prepare herself to testify with someone who not only had experience being a cause célèbre and a political prisoner, but someone who had committed herself to what she called sisterly relationships after her release. And fundamentally, the sisterly relationships gave to Joanne the opportunity to see that she was not considered just an issue or a cause, but that Angela Davis was speaking to her as an individual, that there was her personhood at issue and that it was valued in and of itself. Fifth, undoubtedly one of the greatest contributions of Charlene Mitchell, the first director of the National Alliance, was to make a priority for the Alliance the discussion of a definition of political prisoners. Under Charlene Mitchell's leadership and with Angela Davis, the first National Alliance Conference recalled ideas pertaining to political prisoners, and then they embarked in a passionate discussion about conversations, devoted significant time and critical thought as well as self-criticism to a definition of political prisoner that would permit the Alliance to be consistent in opposition to repression. Who is a political prisoner? The National Alliance's answer was this: people who were in prison as a direct result of their political beliefs and activities, as well as people who were caught up in a web of political repression and therefore were victimized by the system. Six, the fundamental importance of coalitions and the difficulty of sustaining coalitions have been areas in which African American radical women and men have made striking contributions, and in this case, the same was true of Charlene Mitchell. Regardless of the region, with Charlene Mitchell's leadership, the National Alliance activists, having learned a multiplicity of lessons from past coalitions, and particularly from the movement to free Angela Davis, stressed, first of all, having a base in the state in which there was the aggrieved person, and Ann Mitchell, who has been mentioned as one of our organizers, was the person who was the director of the North Carolina branch of the National Alliance. Having a base and then having clear identification of a priority focus, a major question or a main case, and to have a central critical issue or two critical issues to which all cases supported by the Alliance would always have to be linked. Therein, they could continue to have a priority focus, Charlene Mitchell's words and emphasis, and look at different cases but relate them to the main case so that you could defend all of them. There was then also the responsibility of the leadership to actually link conceptually and persuasively the cases to the central or the critical issue, the priority. As I come to my conclusion, I simply want to stress that as the executive director of the Alliance, which very self-consciously focused on building, organizing, and sustaining mass support for victims of injustice, Charlene Mitchell accepted the responsibility of effectively addressing the challenges of functioning within a coalition of which she was not a leader. Charlene Mitchell not only remained on task with victory until victory was achieved, but also gave definitive leadership in the movement to free Joanne Little, handling a number of functions. She raised funds, set up demonstrations, confronted and secured protection in dealing with the FBI, coordinated media, combated anti-communist attacks on the Alliance, and after the verdict in Little's trial, continued to build a mass defense for the release of other political prisoners. Charlene Mitchell permitted the National Office of the Alliance to serve as a source of information or news on the movement and related cases while also devising effective strategies and tactics. It was the Alliance's achievement through Charlene Mitchell to have a positive and radical impact on the movement to free Joanne Little by its involvement, yet not be perceived as narrowing or functioning in any narrow way in that coalition. As I speak of the radical influence in 1975, it is not simply that persons to the left of center offered interpretations and support, but fundamentally there were efforts to expose and then oppose racism, sexism, mistreatment of the poor, abuse of prisoners, injustice in the criminal justice system, and the state of North Carolina. Charlene Mitchell's decades of experience and expertise in organizing facilitated and enhanced a coalition with people in striking respects different from the radicals of the Alliance, in one sense becoming differently radical by dealing with race and sex and class and sexual identity all at once. As an African-American woman and socialist, it was clear to her that the struggle to achieve justice and be genuinely human move toward a multicultural, fully democratic society in which economic justice and equality were realities was a protracted struggle. Indeed, one not achieved in years, but rather in decades. Yet she remained a perceptive and hopeful enough participant to talk about proximate victories and incremental steps and battles. In fact, she articulated and lived the truth so succinctly stated by activist Barbara Smith. The assaults from the present system necessitate that most activists work for reforms, but those of us who are radicals understand that it is possible to do so at the very same time that we work for fundamental change, a revolution. Thank you very much. Charlene Mitchell is the founding national coordinator of the Committees of Correspondence, a democratic socialist organization with chapters throughout the United States. She, as has already been noted, was the founding executive director of the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression, and executive assistant to the president of the Service Employees International Union, and she has been on the front lines fighting for justice, democracy, and peace against racism, sexism, economic exploitation, and all forms of oppression and repression. In this segment, our honoree Charlene Mitchell appears in one of her familiar yet so fundamentally important roles as a speaker at a conference of scholars and activists. This particular conference, the Yari Yari Pambere Conference of Women of Africa and the African Diaspora.
I am suggesting that facts indicate that there is something systemic about the current assault on the working class, and its tentacles affect the whole of society. In the United States, there has been a drop of $1,035 in income since the year 2000. In other words, we are now making $1,035 less than we were 4 years ago. The country's trade deficit is $1.6 billion per day. And the CEOs of major transnationals are making 500 times what an average worker makes in the United States. This is taking place whether the CEO is headquartered in the global north or the global south. The exploitation and the reach for maximum profit increases daily. For years, capitalism has sought to place the responsibility for the loss of jobs on the excessive demands of the trade unions. For so long, the trade union leadership has attempted to place the blame for the loss of jobs in the North on outsourcing jobs and entire plants to the South, including the Southern United States. Of course, the playing field for bargaining is filled with threats of layoffs, plant closings, or moving the business to other countries. Labor is then placed in the position of bargaining from weakness, since the government sides with big business. This results in U.S. workers joining in a race to the bottom as their standard of living steadily decreases. As the struggle continues, we in the global North must join with those who have a strategy to close the gap between the North and the South. It seems to me that this is the way the labor movement here can halt and reverse the onslaught of global capitalism. At the end of the day, even though 150 years have passed, Karl Marx had it right when he said, "Workers of the world unite. Our luta continua," or as the foreign workers proclaim, "Si se puede, we shall overcome."
To quote Angela Davis, the work of the political activist inevitably involves a certain tension between the requirement that positions be taken on current issues as they arise and the desire that one's contributions will somehow survive the ravages of time. Your contributions have certainly survived and they thrive. We thank you again. Fate is given, destiny is won. Destiny is what a man or woman does with the raw materials of experience. We determine what we shall do with our circumstances. So declares the philosopher-theologian Howard Thurman. Angela Davis is a woman of destiny, a woman of agency, who, not having control over the circumstances into which she was born, or the violence on Dynamite Hill, the neighborhood in which she grew up in Birmingham, Alabama, made an early determination about what she would do with her circumstances. With a mother who modeled sensitivity and charity by giving away clothes her children had outgrown to the less fortunate, Angela Davis deduced at an early age that at various levels and to varying degrees, one could distinguish between right and wrong, as well as between human rights and privileges. Most of us are familiar with the story in her autobiography about taking change from her father's coin jar to remedy a wrong and provide for poor elementary school classmates money with which to buy lunch rather than to have to stand in their hunger helplessly observing others eat. At 5 years old, she connected her mother's charitable deeds with right and rights. At 5, she was concerned about a glaring wrong and acted to replace it with a positive right. Irreducible to the iconic figure with the large afro and fist raised high, Angela Davis, the revolutionary, was so incisively and insightfully introduced this morning by Bill Fletcher Jr. in the opening plenary session of this conference. She thereafter facilitated our efforts to gain a sense of history and knowledge about Black women in the radical tradition. The biographical paragraph in your program identifies Angela Davis in her position as the professor of history of consciousness at the University of California, Santa Cruz, working on racial and gender equality, prison abolition, and gay rights, known, of course, in the 1960s and 70s for her early contributions to the civil rights movement. The brief biography speaks as well to her radical activism, a leader of critical resistance, a grassroots organization opposing prison industrial complex, and a member of the Committees of Correspondence for Democracy and Socialism. Yet, if we seek more specificity, we learn that Angela Davis is a brilliant public intellectual, professor, and activist who has used her highest preparation, critical skills, and experience to research and write, engage, and critique. It must minimally be said in any introduction or words designed to present Angela Davis that she is a quintessential scholar activist, the embodiment of the truth that some of the most radical thinkers are products of social movements. Author of seminal texts examining the intersection of race, class, and gender, Women, Race and Class, and Women, Culture and Politics, Violence Against Women and Radical Feminist Theory. Her scholarship includes studies on prisons, the relation of their formation and proliferation to capitalism and racism, the racialization of punishment and the criminalization of blacks, and writings on abolition. She is author of Blues Legacies and Black Feminism, Are Prisons Obsolete? And Abolition Democracy, Beyond Empire, Prisons, and Torture. She should be understood as a scholar activist because of the steady stream of strong scholarship she has and continues to produce. She should also be understood as a scholar activist because of her way of learning and knowing, and because of her commitment to having her findings, conclusions, and analyses written, spoken, and lived. As a scholar activist, she engages in struggle, expecting the experience of struggle to inform and contribute to new knowledge. Speaking of the Joanne Little case and reflecting upon it in 1994, Angela Davis explained, "Many of us learned how to think about these things, the impact of race and gender and class on the movement, in the course of organizing that Joanne Little movement. In a sense, this was a very formative moment in which many of us learned how to discuss the interconnectedness of gender and race in ways that were not possible before." And I would say that my own work on the book that I wrote called Women, Race, and Class would have been inconceivable without that experience and that organizing. Another scholar, Robin D.G. Kelly, who has been particularly perceptive in studying social movements, articulates a conclusion of which I am persuaded. The most radical ideas often grow out of a concrete intellectual engagement with the problems of aggrieved populations confronting systems of oppression. The work of Angela Davis, the life of Angela Davis, certainly provides evidence of this. In addition to being a brilliant scholar and internationally respected, one can hardly imagine a person who would more appropriately speak to the life and accomplishments of Charlene Mitchell than Angela Davis, who in the late 60s, a radical civil rights and black liberation activist, was a member of the Lumumba Collective, beginning a lifelong friendship when she joined that collective organized by Charlene Mitchell. Both Angela Davis and Charlene Mitchell now are colleagues and comrades in struggle as members of the Radical Committees of Correspondence, and Angela Davis will speak to us so that we might truly see and understand her sister in struggle, Charlene Mitchell. Dr. Conrad Davis has consented to answer questions thereafter. Her topic is Living Justice, the Life and Times of Charlene Mitchell.
Thank you. Is this microphone, yeah, because I couldn't hear very well. Maybe I should use the other one. Now it's fine? It is? Okay. Okay. Stand back like this. Okay. Well, thank you for the generous introduction. I must admit I was somewhat embarrassed, considering that we're devoting this time to a tribute to Charlene Mitchell. But I'd like to really thank the organizers of this gathering, and it is again a real honor to participate in this special tribute to Charlene Mitchell. Hi, Charlene. You know, earlier today I was talking about the erasures of people from the historical record, people who don't manage to attain the status of heroic individual, people who truly believe in justice and equality and peace and socialism, should not actually really care whether their contributions are individually noted. And Charlene Mitchell is a leader who has transformed people's lives all over the country and literally all over the world. She has been out front, and she's also done that invisible organizing work and has been totally satisfied to see the fruits of her labor unfold as they do, without necessarily being singled out for her accomplishments. And that's, I think, precisely why we recognize her today. Thank you, Charlene. I don't think I have ever known anyone as consistent in her values, as collective in her outlook on life, as firm in her trajectory as a freedom fighter. We can talk about Charlene Mitchell at age 13 and her first political activity. She joined the American Youth for Democracy in 1943, and I think you actually mentioned the protests work, the protests activities outside of the Windsor Theater in Chicago. Or we could fast forward and talk about Charlene Mitchell representing the Communist Party in the international arena, developing ties with leaders of national liberation movements in Africa during the 1960s and 70s, or organizing and administrating the campaign to free me when I was in jail from 1970 to 1972, creating one of the most impressive mass international campaigns of the 20th century. And I should say that people often ask me whether I'm troubled by the failure to recognize me as in history books. The high school students who were here, but I don't know if they're still here. And I say no. I could really care less whether anybody knows me or my name, but what I do think is important is to retain some historical memory of that campaign for which Charlene was so instrumental. The fact that we did in 1972, or they did, I was in jail, I didn't really do too much of anything except write statements here and there and hope. But the fact that it was possible to bring so many different people together from so many different walks of life, students and workers and welfare rights activists and church people and sorority people and all of that. I mean, it was just absolutely incredible. And we stood up to Ronald Reagan and we stood up to Richard Nixon. We said no, and we prevailed. Now that was amazing. That was amazing. And I think that if anyone should be remembered in the history books, it should be Charlene for that work. Now, last summer I was in Cuba with Charlene as she received rehabilitative treatment for the stroke that she suffered in the summer of 2007. And I was totally impressed by the sense of community she had created in that rehabilitation center. And the first time I went, everybody was saying, hi Charlene, how are you doing? And literally everybody knew her. And there were people there from all over the world. And I was impressed. I said, at first I thought that when they said that Charlene was their hero, because many of them said, Charlene is our hero here. And I thought that they were referring to her political history, but then I asked, well, how could all of those people know about it? And it turned out that they were referring to her strength, her courage in doing the very difficult rehabilitative exercises, often 7 hours a day. Many of the people who had suffered neurological damage and were relearning how to walk or how to use their arms, and they looked to Charlene for inspiration. And every day, Charlene walked the treadmill and did the Stairmaster and the stationary bike. And I mean, it was amazing to witness. Charlene is our inspiration. You know, we often tend to think about the history of our marginalized communities as the history of firsts. And I think that's kind of problematic, because sometimes the first is not necessarily the most progressive. You know, the first woman, the first black person, the first whatever. But Charlene was the first black woman to run for the office of President of the United States of America on the Communist Party ticket in 1968. That was a little over 40 years ago. And that was a major first. And I should say that when we received the news that Barack Obama had been elected president, the first thing I thought of doing was to call Charlene. And I did. I called her and I congratulated her. Exactly 4 decades after she ran for president, I said, Charlene, congratulations, you won. Many people whose names we shall never know. And so I think it's important for us to claim that as our victory. Now, what the man himself is poised to do is quite another story. And I think Charlene tells us that we should be poised to continue exactly the same kinds of struggles to place the pressure on the office of the presidency so that we can indeed move forward. By the time Charlene ran for president, she had been a member of the Communist Party for many years. She joined the Communist Party when she was 16. 16. And you know, I was looking through some of the interviews she's done over the last period, and I found something that, I don't know, maybe I'm the only one who gets it, but I want to share it with you. She was describing her experience at the Abraham Lincoln School, a school where she studied Marxism. And so she read Hearts of Capital, and she said that in the interview she said, well, initially I thought of these ideas as being, I thought of them a little too simplistically. She said, for example, the whole idea of surplus value and how profit is made. I took what were meant as illustrations of surplus value and profit to be actual facts. I imagine a shoe worker working 8 hours a day to produce a given number of pairs of shoes. Then he would only be paid half of what he produced, and the rest would go to the boss. This was clearly simplistic, but it was a good enough example for me to start to read more. And that's when, at age 16, I read the Communist Manifesto. Well, I think that, you know, if we were able to come up with these kinds of examples in these times, we might encourage people to understand a little more of what's going on with the collapse of the capitalist system and the collapse especially of finance capital. She said, the Communist Manifesto was for me the most exciting thing I had ever read. When I was in high school, in English, we read Shakespeare, and the Shakespeare play that I learned to like the most was Merchant of Venice. And we had this big discussion in class about it. While I really admired Portia, I thought Shylock had a point. My ethic was that you make a bargain, you must abide by that bargain. And see, the capitalists had made the bargain, with the workers in terms of paying them for the work that they were doing. And, as you know, the workers don't get paid for the work that they do. They get paid for their capacity to do work, which means that there's, all of this surplus value that ends, well, anyway, we don't need to do Marxist political, but maybe a little Marxist political economy would help us during these times. And so she said, well, I really admired Portia. I thought that Shylock had a point. My ethic was that you make a bargain, you must abide by that bargain. The whole thing about hath not two eyes and noses and so forth. And why am I so bad? Because I do what I want and I'm going to protect myself, so forth and so on. But you made the bargain and you had no problem with that. So she goes on to say the Communist Manifesto was a very exciting thing. There's still much in the manifesto that I read, and sometimes I read it over and over again, and it seems like I'm reading this particular passage for the first time. For example, the whole idea of the globalization of capital. Marx said that it's going to come to that point where as capital grows, it purports to become worldwide. But at the same time, one of the things you had to be careful about during those days when you were called a communist was the question of free love. And I mean, I kind of really like the way that her words conjure up the whole, history of the ideologies around communism. But when in the Communist Manifesto, Marx talks about the fact that communists are accused of prostitution, and she goes on to say, I wasn't doing this only for altruistic reasons. They were just things that seemed to answer so many ideas I had in my mind. This is like, she's like 16, 17. By the time Charlene represented the Communist Party during the presidential elections of 1968, she had been involved in many, many struggles. In 1947, she worked with the United Shoe Workers Union. I guess this is why she was coming up with the shoe analogy, the shoe example. In 1948, she worked for the election of the Progressive Party candidate, Henry Wallace. And in 1949, the Labor Youth League was founded in Chicago, and for the Labor Youth League, Claudia Jones represented the Central Committee of the CPUSA. So she talks about her encounter with Claudia Jones. Well, I could tell you about the way she describes her involvement in the protest of the trial of those who were charged under the Smith Act, Eugene Dennis, for example, and how she collected signatures for the Stockholm Peace Appeal. But what I want to emphasize for you this evening is the role that Charlene played during the McCarthy era in the underground. From 1952 to, was it 1954? Yeah, Charlene's shaking her head. She and her husband, Bill Mitchell, lived in the underground. And they were assisting leaders of the Communist Party who had been, especially James Jackson, who had been forced to flee the FBI. And when I first learned about this, I could remember because my parents knew the Jacksons and other people who were underground, and I can remember being trailed by the FBI frequently whenever we came to New York, and so I kind of think about, okay, we were being followed by the FBI, and then maybe Charlene and Bill at the same time were protecting Jack from being discovered by the FBI. I mean, that was dangerous work. That was really dangerous work. And oftentimes we think about the underground romantically. I know people say, "Oh, you were underground. You were when the FBI." Yeah, and it was really hard. It was really, really hard, emotionally and every other way. I first met Charlene at the end of 1967, and I've therefore known her for the majority of her life now. And I'll never forget the first time I met her. I can actually see her sitting in a chair in Los Angeles, having a conversation with a group of black activists around the theme of the dialectics of reform and revolution. So I appreciate the way you ended your presentation on Charlene and the Alliance and Joanne Little. I think I'm going on too long.
No, you're fine.
And I suppose I can say that first meeting 4 decades ago, that since then, Charlene has remained the person to whom I'm most grateful for having shown me a life path. And I learned from her what it meant to be a communist, what it meant to be a citizen of the world. And I mention this sense of global citizenship because this is precisely what we should be attempting to do these days. Charlene organized movements to defend the Black Panther Party. And I can remember the huge conference that took place in Chicago. I guess maybe that was 1968. Was it 1968 or 1967? To defend all of the members of the Black Panther Party who had been incarcerated. And as you know, she organized the campaign for my freedom. And that's just a little bit too big to talk about. I'll just say that, and I'll say thanks to the work that Charlene and many others did, here I am today, almost 40 years later. But I do want to emphasize how Charlene so skillfully took that movement that had been so successful in achieving one victory, the victory of my freedom, and she fashioned it into a movement that would continue to draw upon those lessons to work for the freedom of other political prisoners, to think about issues such as the repressive role of the institution of the prison. And that was the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression. And so I remember very clearly after my trial was over, and we partied all night long. It was really quite incredible. The local club let us have the club, and we drank champagne. And but Charlene wouldn't let us sleep the next day because she said we had to catch the momentum and talk about how we were going to turn this movement into something that would endure. So the next day, we convened and talked about building, what would become the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression. I just wanted to evoke, if I can, Charlene's travels. She has been in many capacities all over the world. She's been in England and Denmark and Finland and Sweden, Germany. As a matter of fact, there were 2 Germanys, and she went to both of them. Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, the Soviet Union several times, North Korea, Sierra Leone, Guinea-Bissau, and Conakry, Guinea, when Sékou Touré was the Prime Minister of Guinea. She was in Namibia, South Africa several times, Portugal, Spain, and Charlene, I know I've missed some. But you get a sense of the reach of her work. And I said before that she transformed lives wherever she has been. Charlene is always able to discover the very best in people and to help them find ways of cultivating the best they have to offer. I think this has been her brilliance as an organizer, for she not only knows how to build powerful communities of struggle, but she knows also how to invite people to bring their entire lives with them. And so I would like to say thank you, Charlene, for your work, for your inspiration, for the way you have modeled the best kind of activism for so many of us. Thank you for your profound humanity. Thank you for your internationalism. Thank you for your perseverance. And thank you for your abiding love.